we were in the nascent stages of thinking of the incentive program and use it as a brainstorming and a brainstorming session. There will be a lot of time for collaboration with all of you today as well at the end of our small presentation. And I will invite people to come off mute or put their questions in the chat. Blake's going to be monitoring the chat while I'm in presenting mode with the PowerPoint. And I'm really looking forward to this session. So without further ado, I will share my screen. And Blake, can you just confirm that you're seeing the screen?
Yes, looks good on my end.
All right, fabulous. Okay, so this is a slide you probably have all seen before. It's a slide that we in Odo put in most of the beginning of our presentations, just who we are, our mission, and what we do. This particular presentation is for the Building Performance Standard Incentives Program. This incentives program is still being planned, and this is a check-in. Well, we'll get into the agenda a little bit later. But first, just a reminder of how to use WebEx. There are options to raise your hand, reactions. I don't know if you have audio quite yet, but I do have the ability to unmute you, and I am going to encourage people to come off of mute and to give feedback later in the meeting. So here's our agenda for today. It's going to be, we've kind of gone over these quick introductions. We will start with a VPS overview, so where the program is right now, and just a reminder of what the next 6 months to 4 years kind of looks like. We're then going to go into our current building stock. So we've been collecting data over the past 3 months or so, and we're able to start sharing what we have currently. After that, we'll look at the current state of incentives, so sharing what we know with you all. And then the last two are kind of together. It's this idea of application questions, or starting to frame what our incentive program, what we want it to look like. And then I will invite you all to come off and to have an open discussion with us. So let's just go over a quick building performance standard overview. As of January 1st, the rules have been published and the policy is active. A reminder that there are 2 tiers of buildings, Tier 1 and Tier 2. For responsibilities, the overview is Tier 1 must meet EUI targets. These targets are published in the BPS policy. And Tier 2 must submit benchmarking data. So Tier 2 does not need to meet the targets that are published. They just need to start collecting and reporting their energy data. Filing deadlines begin in 2027 for the largest Tier 1 buildings. And the buildings are recommended to start collecting data now for that first filing deadline in 2027. Exemptions for the buildings. For building type, there's 3 exemptions for agricultural, industrial, and manufacturing. There are some exemptions for occupancy and or vacancy, and whether you think you are exempt or you know you are exempt, an exemption form still must be submitted with this program. So into now our incentive program timeline. I think overall, a big disclaimer that this is tentative. you'll see that we are working on a tight timeline. This tight timeline is semi-self-inflicted since we as Odo are setting the launch date. Although this flexibility of us setting the date, us setting the date gives us this flexibility in case we don't have to strictly adhere to this timeline. But we're setting it off of when we are notifying building owners. So in July, building owners are going to receive the first notification that their building is it needs to be in compliance with BPS. So the idea is that we are going to set up this incentive program to launch alongside that notification. However, there's no statutory guideline here or mandate, and although we'll do our best to stick to this timeline, we're also going to ensure that we're not going to rush and we're not going to compromise the incentive program in order to fit these timelines that we created. So let's take a look at our building stock. Currently, we have just over 13,000 buildings. This slide shows the building stock breakdown by county. You'll see that there is a couple of missing counties or countings that don't seem completely full, and that's true. We are missing data from Lane, Klamath, Curry, and Wasco County. However, you'll see in red that they're represented on this map. That's simply based off of the data that we received from the county assessors. So this means that a building in, say, Lincoln County either has an address or an address on file for the building or an address on file for the building owner if the building address is not available in a different county. So we know that we're expecting Lane County's data by the end of the month, and we are in contact with the other counties. You'll also, if you do add up all of these numbers, you'll find that there's actually about 12,600, just in full transparency. That's because around 300 addresses don't have GIS points or lat longs, and about 200 addresses are outside of the state of Oregon. So these discrepancies are because these numbers are based off of a map we've created for these buildings. So we took the county assessor data, we geocoded or reverse geocoded in some cases to put building addresses on a map, and then we took a county layer, so just the outlines of the county, and use that basically as a cookie cutter. So in Baker County, we stamped out, okay, there's 39 buildings there. So around 300 don't have addresses, so they wouldn't be in the map, and around 200 don't have addresses in Oregon, and that's for various reasons. Like the only address on file was the owner's address, and so that would be, and they're located outside of Oregon. But we'll still be able to contact them and make sure that they're in compliance with BPS. So the next different view of our building stock is by utility. So the first thing you may notice is that these numbers do not add up to our current building total of just over 13,000. The table on this screen has both electric and gas utilities. And because we're looking at both of those utility types, it's going to skew the numbers. The main reason for showing these numbers is to understand what type of aid there already is and what kind of support can be available for different areas in the state. So if we look at separating what's in Energy Trust of Oregon territory versus outside, you'll see in red that there are about 23,000 buildings or utility connections that are within ETO, and there's just under 2,000 of these buildings outside of ETO territory. The last breakdown for our current building stock, and I keep saying current building stock because we are getting more data and we're going to continue to distill this data to make it as accurate as possible. But our last breakdown of this current building stock is by building type. There are a few things to point out in this table. So highlighted in red are building types that one can file an exemption from the BPS program. Again, just because the building is agricultural, industrial, or manufacturing does not mean that you don't have to fill out anything. You'll still have to fill out an exemption form. The second thing to point out is the third row down, tax exempt. That refers to buildings such as schools and churches and other such buildings. Lastly, the row before the red highlights, labeled tract. This refers to lots that are usually larger than residential lots. They're typically undeveloped or they have minimal improvements, and that they may be intended for further subdivision. Now, the main reason to show you these numbers is to understand more about which buildings will need to comply and if and how we should use these numbers to give extra support to one type or another. I just threw a lot of data at you, and I know I've been talking pretty fast. So I'm going to pause for a moment, check in with Blake in the chat, and see if there's any questions that I can answer. Blake, you're muted.
This day being in. Oh, can you hear me now? Could you hear me?
I did not. I just unmuted you.
Okay, great. Thanks. So there were a couple questions in the chat, and I've been trying to respond to them in real time, and I don't know if any other response might be needed, but there was just one question around the first compliance date for buildings, whether that was 2027 or 2028. So I just provided a clarification that the largest buildings, 200,000 square feet and larger, that first compliance date for those tier 1 buildings is in June of 2028. And then there was a question, and maybe Madeline, you could address a little bit more about whether or not the list includes both tier 1 and tier 2 buildings in these numbers that you're showing, and the split between, and if we have any better numbers for like the breakdown between tier 1 and tier 2 at this point.
Yeah, great question. The total number, so that 13,000 number you see on your screen, is a combined tier 1 and tier 2. We do not have a current accurate breakdown between tier 1 and tier 2 buildings. We're still working on that. We've started, so I've started with kind of the low-hanging fruit. So you'll see, there is an entire class for multifamily, and this number was doubled, but we've put in the qualifier of the minimum, so took out anything 20,000 to 34,999 to make sure it's only 35K and above. So I'd say that we are getting there, but we probably need like another week or two before we have a good breakdown between tier 1 and tier 2 buildings from this total building stock. Okay, great. If there are no other questions,
There are just a couple more coming through. So there's a question around, is there any pending litigation that may impact the ongoing Oregon BPS program? There is not. And then there's a question from Dave Kobar about the utility building stock data, and how those numbers might appear larger due to some buildings being double covered by the utilities. And that's exactly right, David. So in that list, some utilities both have electric and gas service. So where the breakdown is by utility, there might be some buildings that are served by both utilities, electric and gas, where the total number of buildings remains the same at that 13,000 number, but some utilities are present for some buildings, same building. And then there's a question from Brian Stewart. Why is it that the totals from these three breakdowns of building stock do not agree? Looks like a lot more than 13,000 in the first two slides. And I think this is actually something, maybe Brian, you're looking at the version on the website, and we wanted to mention too that the table, we need to update the table on the version on the website. We actually did a little bit more work on it and recognized an error in some of the programming and coding with the sums. So please reference the version, and we'll update it on the slides that Madeline's showing now. But the building numbers, and Madeline, maybe you can address it too, but the building numbers do align between all three slides.
Yeah, I'm happy to go into that later. I don't want to confuse people by talking about why the numbers were wrong, but if you want to email me or stick on a little bit after, I'm happy to explain where the error came from. It always sucks to have an error, but it's always great when you know where that error came from and to be able to be confident in your numbers. But just let me reiterate that we have in our system 13,234 buildings. There are 12,000 buildings represented in numbers here, and that's because of some of these buildings don't have addresses, so we couldn't put them in the map that we use to grab these numbers. So that's where one discrepancy is from. The second discrepancy of why isn't this 13,000 was just addressed with Dave's reiteration that this is by utility and there are double utilities. And this is 13,234. This one does not have any qualifiers for the number. Anything else?
I do see some other questions coming in that aren't necessarily directly related to incentives. So I just did want to kind of try to refocus the conversation on incentives. We're presenting the numbers on the breakdown of like buildings by county, by type, by utility, to help kind of shape and direct the conversation around how we might break down and set up the framework for our statewide incentive program to provide a little bit more context for this audience. I'm seeing some questions come in around penalties and building changing ownership and the best process for collecting data, which I think we're definitely happy to answer, but I might just commit to responding to those questions individually after the call to keep this moving and kind of focused on the intention of this workshop, which is incentives. Those are all great questions, but just want to keep it moving in line.
All right, well, with that, we'll start showing slides with the word incentive on it. So let's transition away from buildings for a second and turn back towards this word incentives and why we're here, which is the incentives program. So we currently have a total of $14 million to be used towards the BPS program and our incentives. The breakdown of that 14 million comes from two sources. $2 million comes from the state general fund, and that's as directed by HB 3409. And $12 million comes from a grant that we are a subrecipient from. The grant is called CPRG. We're gonna look at these two funding sources one by one. So we're gonna first focus on the $2 million from the state. So the state funds have a few restrictions. The first is that the property must be 15 EUI points worse than the target, and the target is set in the BPS policy. And these incentives also have a statutory cap at 85 cents per square foot for tier 1 and 35 cents per square foot for tier 2. Now, if we go down to the opportunities that can be used for this money, this funding doesn't have any barriers on what it can be used for. But as we go through the right side of this graphic, you'll understand why we are currently thinking of using these funds for non-equipment needs. So that looks like strategic energy management training. It looks like outreach and making sure that building owners are supported throughout the process. So creating trading materials and opportunities for one-on-one help. And on the right of the side of this graphic, you'll see the breakdown for the $12 million. And these funds have a restriction that they must be used for direct energy reduction or direct emission reductions. So as such, the opportunities for this money is focused on equipment upgrades, new equipment, and improvements to systems, anything that can be shown to have a direct emission reduction. I saw a question flash on the screen about if these funds will be equal for tier 1 and tier 2, and that is a pretty good segue into our next slide, which is application questions. So all this information, the building stock, how it's broken down by county, by utility, by building type, and the information on the incentive funds and what they can and cannot be used for. Those are all going to go into making sure that we are supporting Oregonians the best way possible with these incentives. The BPS incentive program does not have the same statutory minimums as other programs, which means that, so when I say statutory minimums, what I mean is that in HB 3409, it did not give us any guidelines, restrictions, or mandates besides the ones that you saw in the previous screen. So this in turn means that we as Odo and you as the public coming to these meetings and weighing in on the public comment period that will follow our official rulemaking, we have the opportunity to weigh in on how to approach fund distribution. We know that we do not want a first come, first serve incentive program. So on your screen is the start of what questions the incentive program could be based on. These applications are going to be filled out by property owners and managers. And I'm first going to walk you through what is on the screen and why we've put it on there. And then I'm going to invite you to come off mute and start sharing your feedback and your questions, like what I saw flash on the screen about distributing the funds equally between the tiers or the timing. But first, let me just walk you through what we currently have as these 6 questions. The first is obvious, it's contact information, always good to know and keep track of. 2 is what stage is the BPS application in? When we are asking this question, we're asking to see what the building owner or manager has already done to position themselves to be in compliance. So have they completed an O&M or an energy management plan? Have they completed an audit? You know, we want to make sure that we are supporting building owners who are already doing the work or planning on doing the right type of work. The third question is asking about the cost effectiveness of the project. So how does the project that they're asking to be funded fit into the portfolio of the actions that they are taking? This goes hand in hand with question 2, and making sure that there's a plan for this money. The fourth is energy efficiency of the project. So what will the funding be used for? 5 is where is the project located? So inside or outside ETO territory, within CGES qualified disadvantaged communities. And the last question that we currently have is how far away is the property from the EUI goal? So this is when question 6 is going to be an objective numerical answer. So we know that there are targets set for tier 1 buildings. The building owners and managers will know those targets and how far away are they currently from that goal. This helps us with understanding the need, the urgency, and sometimes the support that's needed. So before I take down these questions, I want to open up the floor to you all to hear about your feedback and any questions you may have about what we currently have, and most importantly, what you think we're missing.
We do have a few questions in the chat too. Maybe we can address those and then just kind of open it up for people to raise their hand and I guess come off mute and ask some questions. But there was a question from, let's see, from Egan about, can incentives be used to sub-meter group buildings that would allow for SEM, strategic energy management participation?
Okay, so the question is asking, can you use the money to create more clarity on like individual buildings to then be able to create more accurate strategic energy management plans?
I think so, yeah. I think I can take a first pass, I guess. And so yeah, I think that's an idea. It's something that we can consider as we're moving forward. So, you know, particularly with the CPRG funding, it needs to be dedicated toward actual reductions in greenhouse gas and energy use. Potentially a little bit more flexibility with the state portion of the funding, but we just want to make sure that we're, you know, dedicating that funding to the most valuable end use, I guess, and getting the biggest effects from that portion of the funding. There's a question around, will the timing be the same for tier 1 and tier 2 access to incentives?
And I think that's a really good question. I think that's something that should go on this kind of application for the incentives of what tier the building or the properties are in. Because I think that we should be recognizing the different timelines that buildings are on and the different pressures that they're facing.
The next question from Kristen is, what about building envelope improvements and weatherization?
That's a great one for the CPRG funding. So yes.
Thanks. Then there's a question from Juliana about, is CPRG funding fully executed, or will current federal freezes impact that funding? And that's a great question. I can take that one. I think there's still a lot of uncertainty at this point. Our CPRG funding, we're a subrecipient to the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality on that, along with a number of other subrecipients. As I understand it, that funding is fully executed and the contracts are in place, but we do recognize that there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of ongoing variables with a lot of the federal funding that's focused on energy and climate. So we will continue to evaluate the situation and communicate as we know more. But at this point, our agency and other agencies continue to move forward to deliver our federally funded programs, and we'll communicate and digest and let folks know once we know more. There's another question around when and where will forms and guidelines for 2A. I'm not sure, Steve Croxton, maybe if you can come off mute and clarify your question. I'm not actually sure. I'm totally understanding what the question is.
I will say that for when and where forms and applications, the way that I interpret that start of the question, we're going to be posting all of the forms and guidelines and application materials on the BPS website, as well as through the BPS portal that building owners will have direct access to. So our website is probably the best answer for that.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Well,
there's a question around, what's the difference if the project or property is in or out of Energy Trust territory?
That's a really great question, and it's a question that we're still exploring with Energy Trust. I think that all that we know right now is that Energy Trust has really great resources and really great programs for the properties within their territory, and that we want to be able to support their programs and point people to their funding, and also emulate their type of support programs and projects in non-ETO territory. So it's not a great answer to your question, but my main answer is that we are talking with ETO to ensure that people get the best support, no matter if they are in or outside ETO territory.
Mm-hmm.
And sorry, the reason why for question 5A of inside or outside ETO territory is that we know that those inside ETO territory have access to these great programs, and those outside of ETO territory do not automatically have access to those types of programs, which means that they might be a better candidate to get greater support from ODO.
Mm-hmm. There's another question around, will these questions be used to determine who gets access to incentives?
I think that's the idea right now. This is the start of the questions that will decide who gets access to the funding. This is not a complete list, and we're using your questions, your comments, your feedback in these types of forums to continue to grow and revise these questions. For instance, the timing for release of funds of tier 1 and tier 2, and making sure that that's something that is represented in the application. You know, that's why it's so important for people to ask their questions and comments in this type of forum, because this program is not completely flushed out yet, and we are relying on you as experts and you as people who will have to comply to give us your perspective.
There's a question about, these are all site EUIs, correct? Yes, that is correct. And then a question from Jamie, with support that may apply more broadly, like outreach training, how does that interact with the statutory House Bill 3409 cap of spending for tiers?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that that does not have the same financial burden from our incentive funding pool. All of those resources are going to be free and readily downloadable. So I don't know if I've answered that question. Blake, could you help me out?
Yeah, so I think if I understand what the question is, there's going to be like outreach and training that our agency provides, and then there's also some level of like assistance and outreach and training that we hope to achieve with some of the incentive funding as well.
Right.
And we hope to be able to kind of partner those and let them interact with each other to get the most use out of the limited resources that we have at our agency in terms of personnel that can support the program, and then also the somewhat limited resources that we have with other funding that we can leverage to provide incentives in the form of assistance to some building owners with some parts of the funding.
Right. So that funding, the trainings would be used for how to fill out an energy management plan, how to create an operations and maintenance plan. Basically, how do you fill out these forms that we're asking for that a typical building owner or property manager might not have the expertise or experience with.
There's one question that I'll answer here too, and then I know we've got some folks that have had their hands raised for a little bit, so maybe we'll move toward that next. They've been waiting patiently, but there's a question around, does the $2 million from House Bill 3409 funding renew annually? The answer there is that it is currently present in our next biennium budget, the 25 through 27 biennium. We obviously don't know what will happen in future bienniums after that, but it's in our next biennium budget. And that funding, as it's mostly dedicated toward early and voluntary adoption of the standard, as more covered buildings become required to comply, the early voluntary or the early compliance piece kind of phases itself out. But we don't know what'll happen in future bienniums after the next one as far as that funding. So I see 3 hands raised, and if we don't get to any questions in the chat, those are questions that we can certainly commit to responding toward after too. But I see Michael Art has a hand raised, and I will see if I can get Michael off mute. Let's see. Michael, are you off mute by any chance? Okay, let's see. You disappeared from my. Oh, there we go. Okay. Okay. You're up now. Yep.
Yeah, so one of the things I was considering is like the ETO stuff. Is there other incentives that are out there from other municipalities or whatever that may be covering some of this work that is being proposed? And should those types of items be excluded from this because we have a limited fund to work from?
That's a great question, Michael. So we have plans to reach out to these municipalities. And it's all in the pipeline. So our current plan is to be able to reach out to BPA and some of the larger utility kind of I don't even know what you call them, but groups, and then also start a relationship administrators. Thank you, Kathleen. Also start a relationship with the utilities themselves. So we are working with our internal strategy team to find out the best way to start that relationship and to create the best groups to work with the utilities. So we're not meeting with, all 40 plus utilities at once, but making sure they're in groups that they feel comfortable relating to and contributing with. So I think the actual answer to your question is yes, we are going to be talking with the municipalities and making sure that we highlight on our website the different opportunities within the utilities themselves, but also know that some of these utilities just don't have the funds to cover. So I think that's a question that we're kind of exploring, and it's changing as we learn more from the utilities themselves and the administrators.
The next hand raised is from Mary Nitschke. Mary, I think you're off mute now.
Oh, thank you. Yes. So my question is formed around multifamily, which falls into tier 2. Looking at the requirements for AB 3409, it is necessary for the property to understand what their current EUI is in order to qualify for the funds. Since multifamily is weird and the units can be separately metered, and the utility providers are more than likely not going to be set up to provide that whole building data that the operators are going to need to get to that EUI score, is there going to be part of that fund reserved for this class of real estate?
So far, we have no funding reserved for anyone. This is why we're having these types of conversations. We definitely recognize that multifamily, as you say, is weird. It's very complicated. One of the reasons why we're reaching out to utilities is to understand how we can best support in some of these more complex cases. And then we also have a really great privilege of not being the first program to enact BPS, and being able to talk to the state of Washington, state of Maryland, other jurisdictions around the country to understand how they've been able to approach this is something that we're going to take full advantage of. There's no need to reinvent the wheel, and being able to learn from others is the best way forward for us. So I don't have a direct answer for you, besides we're aware of the complexities, and we want to make sure that we're not just being aware, but we're being proactive in helping people be guided through the complexities.
Thank you.
And I'll add on too that a separate part of our rulemaking included the requirement in our larger utility territories for utilities to aggregate data for buildings like multifamily buildings that have multiple meters, and provide that to the building owner to help with that that whole building energy usage understanding.
Yeah, I'm just concerned that, and would be happy to talk offline if we can continue this conversation. I'm concerned for this class of real estate that the providers, it takes some time for them to get that aggregation set up so that the data is anonymized and we're not creepy with our residents. And we want that, but we also want the same chance at funding as everybody else. So we love and appreciate the work that you have done with the utility providers to get that aggregation for us, because we cannot manage what we cannot measure. But we want the same. We want to start at the same starting line of everybody else.
Yeah, I absolutely hear what you're saying, and I will most likely take you up on your offer to talk offline, especially as we create different guidances and different like example forms or templates for both utilities and for people who are asking for aggregating data. I think having a perspective like yours and other people who are very in tune with multifamily needs and kind of how complex they are, to be able to give us feedback on those forms to make sure that we're hitting our mark and we're making this as easy as possible, most efficient as possible. It's not easy, but
nothing good is ever easy.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would be delighted to assist in any way I can. Thank you.
Thank you.
And the next hand raised is for Tyler Smith. Tyler, you should be off mute now.
I think I'm out.
Yes.
Okay, cool. So we're kind of in a role where we're advising building owners about this, and I'm kind of curious to just kind of back out for a sec and get a little bit of a 100-foot view here, because it seems that every one of our clients that we've spoken to about this has never even heard of this. So we're kind of putting ourselves on the ground floor here, trying to champion the understanding of this system and be able to explain it simply to our building owner clients. So can you help me understand, and I may be working off some information that might be slightly fragmented and incomplete from my own research, but is there, when I'm speaking to a building owner that's never heard of this before, like what exactly can I tell them about the big picture here? Like it seems like there's going to be some requirements for how much energy their buildings use, and I'm curious about like their questions that are going to be coming down the line, which is, are there penalties if they don't meet the required amount of energy, or is this all just like now incentive based, like you can do retrofit and get incentive and there's no like penalties or anything? So can you kind of speak to that and help me understand how I can advise these people?
Tyler, I am not going to speak on that right now because this is, we want to focus this on incentives. But what I can do is I can send you some graphics and easy flow diagrams to help kind of break down that 10,000 foot view. And I'd be happy to jump on a call with you later and just go one-on-one and go as deep as you want.
That'd be fantastic, actually. Yeah, could get a couple members of our team on there. That'd be really helpful.
Yeah, no worries. And I think for everyone else on this call who's thinking, wait, me too. I think in the coming weeks, especially in February, we're going to be starting to revamp our website, and this materials that I'm talking about, these graphics, are going to be available for everyone to see, and we're going to continue to try to break down this BPS program so that everyone, yeah, Shannon, I see what you're saying. That everyone will be able to have these easy to read materials and easy to easy to read and understand. And I'm always here too to answer those questions or to jump on a call.
Okay, so can you speak to the incentives part of it then and help me understand? Is this similar to Energy Trust, where if a building is undergoing a rehabilitation program or something like that, then they are potentially eligible for these incentives that we're discussing through this program? Is that accurate?
Sure. So, close. I've gone back to this incentive slide and to talk about which cases a building can apply for these incentives. Because broadly, the $2 million from HB 3409 are only available to properties that are 15 EUI worse than the published target. So if your property has no idea where they are in how close they are to the target, they will first need to understand those numbers before having this money be accessible to them, the $2 million. For the $12 million, that funding has to be used for direct emission and energy reduction. So you could use this money if you are retrofitting your energy systems, but that's where these questions come in, because we want to make sure that not every building that wants to do a retrofit is going to get money for it. Some buildings need the funding a little bit more than others, and since we're dealing with such a limited fund, this workshop, as well as the rulemaking process that we're going to go through, is all about making sure that we are allocating funds to in the most equitable fashion.
Okay, that makes sense. So they'll have to do basically an energy audit if they don't have this data to even know if they can comply or if they're eligible.
That's correct. They'll need to get the data, maybe an energy audit, but specifically they first just need to look at their data. Yeah.
The data from the utilities of how much they've used.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense.
Thank you, Tyler.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Okay, I think that's all the hands raised, but there are just a few more questions in the chat, and I recognize that we're kind of going up against time. We have 5 minutes left, so we'll try to get to everything we can live here, but if there's any remaining ones, we'll respond afterwards. Madeline, for some reason, the screen share is no longer the PowerPoint.
Oh, yeah.
Some
I
code.
took it. Oh,
Yeah.
I see. Are you looking at my code?
Yep, there we go. Yeah, all right.
Yeah, you gotta see how the sausage gets made. You're welcome.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. There was a question around, will the funding be awarded on a competitive basis, or will applicants need to meet certain predetermined criteria to get funding?
Yeah. So again, that's where these questions come from. We know it's going to be competitive because we're not going for a first come, first serve model. So that automatically makes it competitive. And then it's how we use these questions going forward to prioritize the projects. Whether we do it through a committee or through scoring is been undetermined yet. And if you have thoughts one way or another, I would love to hear them. I know we're running out of time, but I encourage you to send me an email, send Blake an email, set up time with us, because that's kind of the next phase of this is when we have these questions and how do we use them. So that's as much as I can say, because that's as much as I know.
Right. The next question is, if we do not qualify for Energy Trust funding, will we be able to qualify for this incentive funding? The answer is yes. This incentive funding will be available on a statewide basis. There's a question around, does tier 2 buildings have an energy target? There are EUI targets for tier 2 buildings listed in the rules, even though tier 2 buildings are not required to meet those targets by the dates, but they're included for reference in there. And there's the potential for a tier 2 building to potentially be eligible for these incentives as well. There's a question of, if an exempt property class, ag and industry elect to participate in the BPS, can they access incentives? Madeline, I don't know if you want to take that one, or.
I mean, I believe that they can. That incentives are available for early and voluntary compliance. So if you're exempt and you want to comply, that falls under voluntary. And as long as you're doing it before your date passes, that's early. So, Brian, yes, they would have access to incentives.
Let's see, going other questions down the line. Can the incentive funding be provided to obtain an audit?
It's a great question, Kevin, and something that we are looking into. We know that audits and finding auditors can be hard and expensive, and we know that you can't use the CPRG funding for it, and so we're looking at how to use the $2 million for that advantage, but no yes or no answer on that.
Let's see, there's a question about, can we access the data that the building counts were based on?
It's a great question. I believe so. We
Right,
don't have a good way of sharing it quite yet, but we are using all publicly available data.
Right, I'll note that it's a work in progress for sure. I think as we get better definition, a lot of that information could potentially be, somehow published on our website, but a lot of that's still kind of to be determined, I think. And I recognize that we're at time now, so I know there's still a few questions in the chat. And we will we'll respond to those, and just know that there'll be a recording of this meeting posted up on the website too, along with the slides and the revised slides for the meeting too. Madeline, anything else to close out?
No, I'm just looking at this really quickly, and Eric's question on if we can send all of that to all of what I assume is kind of the graphics and 10,000 foot view. Yes, we can send it out to the distribution list. And I just want to say thank you to everyone who participated and came and took time out of your day and gave us feedback. We're here to answer questions. Please feel free to email us. And yeah, thank you for coming.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Madeline.